The United Nations Security Council has finally passed a resolution that calls for an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. Now, Israel's longtime ally, the United States, it is interesting to point out, chose to abstain from vetoing this resolution that called for an immediate ceasefire. Now, experts say that this actually highlights an all-time low of ties between the American President Joe Biden and the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu during this war. Soon after the vote, Netanyahu abruptly announced the scrapping of a visit by senior Israeli delegation to Washington. The aim of the meeting was to discuss Israel's planned offensive in Rafah. And according to Netanyahu's office, the failure of the US to veto the resolution is a clear retreat from its previous position, and it will hurt the Israeli war effort. The threat of an offensive on Gaza's Rafah has increased tensions between the United States and Israel. Experts say that if the crisis is not managed carefully, then it's only going to worsen with time. The suspension of the meeting in Washington also jeopardizes US's efforts to tackle the humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. At the same time, it also puts a major obstacle in the way of the Biden administration to get Netanyahu to consider the alternatives to a ground invasion of Rafah. Now, Biden's decision to abstain from UN voting also appears to reflect the growing US frustration with Netanyahu. Now, earlier in the month, Biden had said that Rafah invasion by the Israelis would be a red line which would result in a catastrophic number of casualties. It also added that the United States is not going to cut off military aid to Israel and that the United States will continue arming and sending more weapons to the state of Israel. Netanyahu has dismissed Biden's criticism and has vowed to press forward in Rafah. On the other hand, both the leaders are dealing with political pressures. In November, Biden will be facing his Republican rival Donald Trump as he's aiming for another term in the White House. The US president faces pressure not just from America's allies but also from a growing number of fellow Democrats as they are calling to limit Israel's offensive in the Gaza Strip. At the same time, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is facing a number of domestic challenges. The far-right coalition members are demanding for a hard line against the Palestinians. He's also facing growing calls from hostage families to bring back their loved ones, and the frequent protests calling for Netanyahu's resignation add to his problems. And also earlier we spoke with our correspondent Jody Cohen from Israel, where we asked her about the reactions to the UNSC resolution, particularly in relation to what it means for the hostage release deal and also for the US-Israeli ties.
So Hamas praised the resolution which calls on all parties to ceasefire for Ramadan. Then it fired rockets at Israel and appeared to reject the hostage release deal. And Hamas head Haniyeh is now heading to Iran for meetings. Now, Israel suggested that the vote gives Hamas hope that the international pressure will lead to a ceasefire without them having to release the hostages. Prime Minister Netanyahu has called off the Israeli delegation that was going to Washington, and his office said that the US has abandoned their policy in the UN, which was to link calling for a ceasefire to the release of the hostages. Now, the US has said there's no shift in policy. The resolution is non-binding, that Hamas could achieve an immediate ceasefire by accepting the hostage release deal. And the White House reportedly sees the cancellation of the Israeli delegation as being for Netanyahu's domestic audience. But many Israelis view the US's vote as motivated by the US election, and some commentators have suggested that the US move has emboldened Israel's enemies.
And we also asked Jody Cohen about what the US vote likely means for the Israeli planned invasion of Rafah. Listen to what she had to say.
So Defence Minister Gallant is already in Washington, and he said that Israel has no moral right to stop the war until all the hostages are home. Remember, there are 134 Israeli hostages who've been held captive in Gaza now for 6 months. The youngest is 1-year-old Kfir Bibas and the oldest is 86-year-old Shlomo Mansour. Now, Gallant met with National Security Advisor Sullivan, who conveyed Biden's ironclad support for Israel. He met with Secretary of State Blinken, who reiterated their opposition to a Rafah ground operation. And on Tuesday, Defense Secretary Austin is presenting Gallant with the US's alternative ideas to defeat Hamas. Now, US war expert John Spencer has said that Israel has set a new standard in urban warfare and that other militaries should learn from Israel. Israel says it doesn't see an alternative to evacuating the civilians and carrying out a ground operation in Rafah, that it needs to defeat Hamas, who have pledged to carry out a 7th of October style massacre against Israel again and again. So it remains to be seen what is decided when it comes to Rafah.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.